Hello there. My name is Glade/Blue, and I'm the co-founder and general manager of BDGG. On the cusp of Mythic opening, I thought I'd have some of the officers sit down with me and discuss their impressions of Castle Nathria, and to an extent speculate on what the next week or weeks have in store for a super high-end guild like us, but also the player base in general. If there's anything we don't cover in this discussion, feel free to head over to Wowhead, and they've got tons of guides and discussions about these subjects as well. Joining me, I have Lozy, who's the raid leader, co-founder, and GM of BDGG. He'll be taking on his new role of the 21st Raider, which incidentally, BDGG have been doing since Argus. Comfy, the man, the mage, the legend, here to talk about ranged mechanics. Dubsy, our newly minted main tank, and king of having a bad mic. He'll be talking about challenging fights for tanks. And Shampy, our heal lead, who will be leading the community and complaining about the state of Disc, but will also speak to healing in Castle Nathria in general. First off, how does it look and sound?
First impression of the theme of the raid is super interesting. It's just super gothic looking. I think it's a super unique theme and visual aesthetic that we haven't seen before. The colors are nice. The music's fun. I think the bosses are super cool as well. I just think the whole Shadowlands aesthetic is really interesting. With like maybe one or two exceptions, most of the fights feel complete and well thought out and decently tuned, yeah, I just think the mechanics are pretty fun.
Favorite bosses?
I think my favorite fight is Zymox. I'm more partial to that fight. It's very heavy movement. I have the opportunity to play a mage on it, so I have Door Shadows, 2 Shimmers, a Alter Time. I can be on one side of the room, then other side of the room. I feel like there's a lot of strategic play you can make from the mage class on that fight, so I'm looking forward to see how we can utilize that.
Maybe Sludge Fist. Sludge Fist was pretty fun. I think a fight like that where the DPS check is so high that it suggests or makes you think about the possibility of underhealing, but like it's still not a pushover healing wise. I think fights like that are super interesting. And it was fun mechanics.
It's a good example of a patchwork fight in modern WoW. There's not a ton of complex mechanics. It's just really a single target burn and a bunch of really hard hitting movements and mechanics that have to be well optimized in order to meet that threshold.
I think a lot of people, when they see the mechanics for Sludgefish, are going to think it's going to be a pushover, and then they're going to realize how much of a coordination check it's going to be.
I'm a little torn on like the patchwork tag, because I saw Fat Boss call it a patchwork fight and they got kind of lit up in the comments. But I think in terms of modern WoW, like this, especially for a later half boss, I think this is like about as easy mechanically as you could make it, but still sort of be a patchwork or patchwork adjacent. But yeah, I don't think the mechanics are like. The mechanics aren't what stands out to me. It's just like the design of the fight and how tight it ought to be. Hopefully, when we get to it on live, it will actually be as tight as it promises to be. But yeah,
I think my favorite fight is Artificer. I think it's going to be another coordination check, and I think it's going to be really insane, like movement wise. I look kind of forward to it. I don't know. I think that fight with the 3 phases and how like tight the last phase is going to be, with how many mechanics are overlapping, I think could be a really difficult fight. I look forward to seeing what guilds do on it.
I'm a little nervous about the end of that fight. As an immobile class, I'm thankful that I'm playing a Covenant that gives me a little extra mobility, because that fight terrifies me in terms of like performing the dance in the last phase.
Yeah, I think the last phase on that fight is going to be an absolute chaotic shitstorm that I'm looking very much forward to.
Yeah, and that is like the real fun part of that fight too. I mean, the first phase by itself, it's pretty bland, and I think that's the type of fight for me. As somebody who works deeply, into the strats, and from more of a raid lead side, that is the fight, or I guess one of the 3 fights that you probably really need to dig into and unravel. to kind of figure out how to solve it, and stuff like that is, I mean, super fun. That's why a lot of us play the game, right? It's just live puzzle solving. So my favorite fight from testing, it's probably kind of hard to say because I think I worry about it being exactly the same going forward. Artificer's like definitely gonna receive minor tweaks, but I really enjoyed that fight from just a strategy and raid leader perspective. Same thing with generals and sire. I like the harder fights more so than the easy fights. I feel like easy fights you just kind of look at, you solve, and like you're just playing your character. But these longer fights where you actually have to sit down and analyze data and come up with plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D are a lot more interesting and a lot more fun. Things that are more in depth are just more fun to get into than things that take 5-10 minutes to solve.
I think when you look back at a tier after the fact, it's very frequently like the last two bosses are the most interesting, but because this tier's a little weird because in testing we tested generals quite a bit, but we accidentally got to pull Mythic Sire because Blizzard messed up a little bit, but normally you don't get to test the last boss on Mythic, so it's hard to say exactly how fun it's going to be before the fact. But usually those bosses like that are going to be interesting when we look back. I think right now strategizing like Artificer in general seems to be the most like interesting discussion points on our end.
So in theory, like Sire could be the most interesting. You guys just don't know enough about it.
I don't know if that's we didn't know enough about it. I think it's just like we know that fight obviously is going to demand most of our attention for the rest of the tier. I think it's just we've had more exposure, like Champy was talking about, in particular to generals, where we have a lot more data for that fight. So I think we believe a lot more in our conclusions than we do on our Sire conclusions.
What about tough bosses?
Bosses to look out for in this tier are Artificer and I think Sludge Fist generally is going to be a higher pull count, but Artificer and maybe Council will surprise people.
Yeah, Council for sure. So Council, for those that don't know, basically is an entirely new fight after the expansion got delayed. The old version of the fight got scrapped, and this new version is A, entirely new, and like B, a lot harder. It is an end wing boss, so you would expect it to be a little bit harder than most of the other fights in the instance. It was a little too easy before, so I think if people are looking at super old testing data, or if people just stopped following for some reason after it got tested the first couple times, they're definitely going to be surprised by that fight. But I think like potentially even earlier than those fights. We saw in Ny'alotha, everybody was like, N'Zoth's going to be hard, like maybe Carapace, and like after the first three bosses, fights were just an entirely like tier up in difficulty. So who knows where this is? I think you can make arguments that almost everything other than like the first two are DPS checks. I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. Gearing going into this tier is a lot different than it's ever been. I don't know if that means fights are going to be tuned lower. I don't know if that means we're just going to be weaker and everything's going to be harder earlier. There's no way to know until that Tuesday.
I want to add on to that because I think the gearing point is actually super interesting because if you look at Ny'alotha, Blizzard didn't really account for how powerful people would get with corruption gear. And so anytime a guild got to a boss, they'd wipe, and then that boss would respawn with like 60% more health. Just because Blizzard had to hotfix on the fly to make the boss take as long as they wanted it to take. And then I think this tier might surprise people because Mythic Plus gives lower eye level. There's no Titan Forging or War Forging. Sockets are fewer in frequency, and just Heroic in general is going to give a lot less gear. Splits are harder to pull off to get the same level of gear. So I think the gearing point might make this tier harder just in the tuning department. Blizzard may not hit it on the head this time.
I think to add on to that, with the Mythic Plus, it's not only going to give you one piece of gear. So like you're going to get even fewer returns in Mythic Plus. Not only even in raid where you're only getting 3 pieces per 20 people. going to be really interesting to see what happens with tuning.
How long until the first guild downs to Nathrius?
Like the tier, I think it's going to be a week and a half, maybe a week and 2 days. I'm hoping it's 1 week due to Christmas, but realistically, I think it's going to be a week plus 2. I think for World First, it's going to be a week plus 2.
I don't think this one's gonna die the first reset. I think it could die early in the second reset. I think it'll die before Christmas. So probably Tuesday, maybe Wednesday of the second reset would be. I think that's a pretty safe guess. I think if you were to predict that it would die the first reset, I think that's probably an issue of Blizzard missing the mark on tuning.
Do you guys think there's reason to believe that Blizzard would want it dead before Christmas on the World First scale?
Other than not having to go to work on Christmas.
I mean,
Well-
yeah, and kind of having pity.
I'm not gonna say like I don't think they care because that sounds a little too malicious, but I think they just they release content and kind of let chips fall where they may. I think there's a pretty good chance you can kill this in the first reset. I mean, we know first tiers are always quicker. I think the level of competition in this tier, especially already, I know before the fact it has been stepped up just immensely from around the globe.
I think we're getting a little Christmas miracle on our hands. I think we're going to get a Then Boss will die on Christmas. I think with how little gear we're going to be getting, people are not going to be used to it, and the tuning is going to be kind of scuffed. So I think that, when everything falls, it'll be on Christmas Day.
Are there any fights with particularly dangerous mechanics? What fights are there with mechanics that are overly single-player oriented, like Kill Jaden Soaks or things like that, where one player messing it up will destroy the pull?
I think a good example of a fight like that would be Zymox. You have multiple people picking up the pods or seeds and dropping them around the room, and it only takes one of those people to place it in the wrong spot or die with it in the wrong spot, and it's a wipe.
A hidden one is actually a Nerva. It may not necessarily be like exactly like one guy, because mechanics tend to hit 3 people at a time on that fight. But you can have one guy mess up and it'll ruin the pull for sure.
Towards the back end of the raid, there's a couple of those fights. I think in Sludge Fist, there's probably a few different ways you can wipe the raid. Not only if this does end up being a DPS check, snapping chains and then not having it, but being out of position for soaks there. Generals, baiting bad leaps, baiting bad meteors. All those are potentially raid wiping mistakes.
For me, I think Sludge Fist would be one where Carl could really screw you over. You have to do a soak. He snaps a chain. Both you guys miss your soak. The raid's all dead. And then, or if Carl is, for some reason, your tank, and he gets the hateful charge, and he just doesn't hit the pillar with it, raid's also dead.
And what about the raid composition? Any fights in particular where comp is really strict, or spec advice that should be adhered to, if at all an option? Like, don't touch this spec, or this spec needs to come to this fight.
I don't think a spec is impossible on any given fight. I think you'll see top end guilds stack certain fights, especially later on. Top end guilds tend to treat sort of the beginning of the instance as loot bosses rather than actual bosses that need to be, comped around for mechanical reasons. But if we're talking 2-3 weeks down the line, you should be able to play whatever on almost any boss.
I think it really depends on class tuning, right? They're going to change it hopefully before Mythic Week and let it stay the same for a bit. But, there's always that chance that one spec could be really good before Heroic, and then 2 weeks into Mythic, it's nerfed into the ground, and vice versa. So
I think to add on to that, there's no fight that's going to require you to stack 10 immunities like in Azov. So people should really be focusing on what they want to play rather than trying to play the meta.
From a healer perspective, I think the World First race might be a little misleading about what to bring. I think I've actually had people DM me freaking out that they don't have 2 Disc Priests, and I think it's fine. Especially if you're not week 1 of Mythic heading in there trying to blow up the raid. I think it's more than fine to just bring whatever healers you have available to you, what classes you have available to you, and I wouldn't shy away from monks or druids at all, which people tend to do.
I think throughout testing, there's a lot less fights this year where we were like, wow, cancel melee. So I think that's like probably a good sign that comps later on are going to be a little more flexible. There's like maybe still 1 or 2 fights, but they're kind of early on.
I think a good example of a fight that may be more class dependent would be, again, Zymox, because you're going to want mobile classes that are able to move those pods and those seats around. If you bring a bunch of non-mobile classes like a DK, you're going to have a lot harder time if you're stacking DKs on that fight, moving those seats around. So if you can get, hunters, mages, windwalkers, anybody that can move a large distance in a short amount of time, you're going to be looking good. In previous tiers, there's been strong metas around heavily stacking multi-dotters or certain execute classes, and from what we've seen, unless you're progressing, trying to clear this instance in the first week, 2 weeks, you should be safe bringing, what your players enjoy playing and not worrying about bringing 10 Shadow Priests to a Covenant of Savara fight.
Have covenants and their restrictions impacted you?
There still exists a play for tactical swaps, right? There are 2 very different fights at the end of this raid, and some covenants are just better in certain situations, and especially since this tier there's not a lot of gated power. We're at very low renown levels, we have very small soul binds. Swapping covenants gets you just essentially like 95% of the power of the other covenant.
The covenant system I'm okay with. The main issue that I have with it is when it comes to progressing tiers that are a week long. For instance, I play a mage, so Frost Venthyr is what you want to be if you're playing Frost. Let's say I want to play Frost for the first 4 fights, and then I want to switch to Fire for the next 2 fights, and then I want to switch back to Frost for the remainder of the instance. I actually can't switch back to Venthyr Frost on my mage because there's a 2-week cooldown to get back into the Covenant. So I'm locked into Fire for the rest of the instance unless I want to play Frost as a Night Fae, which isn't as good as Frost as a Venthyr.
So for Covenants, I mean, I kind of like the system. I just wish they would make it kind of like Talents, but like more like refined, where you could like change Covenants, but you're that renown level for that Covenant and you have to grind that up instead of like being stuck to one Covenant for an extended period of time. Because for me, when I was playing my Prop Paladin, which I played Rep for PvP, when I went to PvP or do Mythic Plus, I want to be Kyrian. But for a raid, I want to be Venthyr because Ashen Hollow does an insane amount of damage. But when I'm PvPing, I have to cast a 2-second cast of Ashen Hollow to use my Covenant ability, which is going to get kicked, or I'm going to just rage and I'll be mad the whole time. The only perk to having Ashen Hollow is that it can get people out of stealth. When I watch some other Ret Paladin who's Kyrian, he pops his Divine Toll ability because it's broken as fuck, and he one-shots someone. I can't do that. That's fucking bullshit. I just want to be able to one-shot people with my homies. Instead, I have to play this jank-ass Covenant, and I'm just pissed. I'm going to have to grind my arena rating up on the Heroic Week, and I'm going to have to be Ashen Hollow because that's what's best for the raid. And that should not be the case. I should be able to swap.
What is the hardest fight for your role?
I'd say probably Sledge Fist. It's just the hardest to manage on such a tight enrage, especially while trying to contribute as much damage as possible. There's a lot of movement. Tanks get kind of dookied on Sledge Fist, so you can't just like heal the raid the entire time. You got to keep the tanks from getting one shot.
I think overall, the hardest fight's gonna be Sire. That's how it always goes. That's an easy answer. But pound for pound, I would think it would be Generals. I think Generals has a lot of stuff going on, especially once you get into Phase 3. Everything's happening back to back to back to back. There's like multiple things that have to be assigned out, and there's about 3 or 4 different reasons why you would need to change all those assignments on the fly. I think that fight gets really hectic as it goes on, whereas Sire is a lot more of just like fine-tuning a bunch of little things and then executing that plan.
So I think for tanking, I think the hardest fight that's going to like take my most brain power will be generals. There's just a lot of ads to control, and you have a lot of tight taunt swaps, where you need to taunt the boss before you get hit by the meteor. Otherwise, you're just going to get railed. But I think like the boss so I think that will be the hardest to like mentally like tank. The hardest boss that's going to be for like getting railed is obviously going to be Sludgefist, because that boss is just going to hit tanks as hard as it possibly can, especially with the DPS up. So I look forward to both those fights. I think both present different challenges, and see which one is actually harder than that. So there's two bosses on melee that I think are going to be hard. I think Sludgefist, because if you're playing the Momo build on DH, you might break your link with your partner, and like if you like for DH in particular, that can be pretty challenging. But for all the other classes, it should be pretty simple. So the hardest boss, I think, for all the other melee is going to be Council. You're going to have to be really cognitive of where the tanks are positioning the lunge from Spevros. And if you get hit by that more than once, it's probably going to kill you. But I think the rest of the fights are pretty melee friendly. Obviously, Sire is, well, we will have to see for Sire, but I think that will also be melee friendly as well.
It's hard because maybe I'll just put that caveat in there, because like I feel like saying a range, like a fight is hard for range, just like
Yeah.
Range is the hardest role in the raid. I don't know. Anyone tells you differently does not play Moonkin. I'll tell you that right now. You ever miss an innervate, you get flamed. You miss a wild charge, you get inflamed. You don't drop a full moon when you should, you get flamed. It is what it is. Hard life for Moonkin players.
I just think from a range perspective, range are normally easier mechanically to play on every boss. You're not standing in that much fire. You're able to move around more freely than melee. You're not chained to being in melee range of a boss. But I think Zymox is going to be one of those fights where there's going to be a lot more planning on your movement. You're going to have to be able to cast more while moving and really figure out how to get the most DPS out while traversing this entire stadium and not just being in melee blindly following where the boss is going.
Any fights that might take guilds by surprise?
I think Council will be the most sleeper hard boss out of the whole Castle Nathria.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it was a joke for a super long time. Everybody saw the posts, everybody saw the memes. We tested it like 5 or 6 times in all its various like shapes and sizes, and almost all of them were super, super simple and super easy until this last one. So if I had to guess what fight people are under prepped for, it'd be that one.
Actually, I think you're both big dumb idiots. I think the biggest sleeper fight this tier is gonna be Hungering Destroyer. I think it has the biggest Ashbane potential, where it's way more difficult than people expect. It's gonna be I think it's possible there could be just like some insane like new tuning come Mythic week, and it just catches people off guard.
Yeah, that's a shit take. I'm gonna go with Council. I don't really mean that, Champy. I think you're right, honestly.
Yeah, not to hearing that, I kind of agree, but
Yeah,
we'll go.
I've heard whispers.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with Champy. Oh. Fuck, can I change my answer now?
No, you're locked in.
Sorry, bro. Joke's more important than your actual opinion. Lastly, why do some high-end players have duplicate characters, like 4 Kyrian Hunters? Is this a Covenant thing?
No, that's not the reason. A lot of people in the high end leveled multiple of a class strictly for gearing purposes. Since there's really going to be no gear trading week 1, if you know you're playing a certain class, let's say you are a Mage 1-trick or a Boomkin 1-trick or a Brewmaster 1-trick, whatever the case is, playing multiples of that class gives you basically just multiple raid clears on different characters, and then you just pick which one has the best gear, and that's what you're playing for Prague.
So there you have it. We hope this gives you a little insight into our outlook going into the raid. And hopefully, we'll see you all soon in Castle Nathria.